to today's virtual program of the Commonwealth Club of California with renowned journalist and CNN national security analyst Peter Bergen. I'm Brian Fishman, Director for Counterterrorism and Dangerous Organizations at Facebook, and former Director of Research at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. I am pleased to be your moderator for today's program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Peter Bergen, journalist, documentary producer, CNN national security analyst, Vice President for Global Studies and Fellow at New America, and author of the new book, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm pleased to say that I worked for Peter years ago at New America, and so I'm particularly excited about today's discussion. Peter has been called the world's leading expert on Osama bin Laden. As we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11, what is the lasting influence of this man? In his new book, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden, Peter provides the first reevaluation of the man responsible for al-Qaeda's attacks on the United States, which precipitated America's long wars with al-Qaeda, its allies, and its descendants. Peter discusses bin Laden in all the dimensions of his life, as a family man, as a zealot, as a battlefield commander, as a terrorist leader, and as a fugitive. Thanks to the exclusive interviews with family members and associates and documents unearthed only recently, Peter's portrait of bin Laden reveals who he really was and why he continues to inspire a new generation of jihadists. Today, we're going to have a conversation about the man who set the course of American foreign policy for the 21st century and whose ideological heirs the U.S. continues to battle today. Welcome, Peter Bergen.
Well, Brian, great to be with you. And I think it would be more fair to say that we worked together for many years. And it was, it's great also that you're doing what you're doing at Facebook since so many of these terrorist groups have exploited the platform, and trying to make sure that they don't is obviously very important.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Peter. And thanks very much for taking the time. It's really a pleasure, and I enjoyed the book. My question is, you've written a number of books, obviously, and the world is your oyster. Why this book right now?
I mean, there are a few dimensions of that. I teach at Arizona State, and one of the bright students in the class who was, I think she was like 19 at the time, she asked me, what's the difference between the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban? And I was like, well, actually, that's a really good question. There's a lot to unpack there. And I realized that the kids that I'm teaching at Arizona State, and they're not kids, I mean, they're students, weren't born on 9/11 in many cases. And the people who are volunteering to fight in the U.S. military often weren't born on 9/11. So for them, 9/11 is as distant an event as, say, the Korean War is for me. It's something that happened in history. Of course, it continues to influence events even to this day, and we're in the middle of the final pullout of Afghanistan and the non-combat mission in Iraq. So that was one dimension of it. Was just it seemed like the 20th anniversary was a good time to and I've spent 2.5 decades reporting on bin Laden, and there are still things that I'm learning from the documents, not least the 470,000 files that were released, that in fact West Point, where I used to work, was the first to kind of interpret them. Nellie Lahoud, who's a New America Fellow, was the lead on that, and she's kind of the world's leading expert on those documents. She herself will have her own book coming out in spring of 2022 about the documents. And it's really a kind of, bin Laden never expected that every single memo he'd written or every letter he'd received or sent would suddenly fall into enemy's hands. So it's really bin Laden unplugged, as it were, kind of what he was really thinking. And the big discovery in those documents was the bin Laden family journal, which was written in Arabic and was handwritten. And it's sort of not easy to interpret. And I had the help of Nadia Wadat, who I think you know, Brian, who a leading scholar of Islamist thought, who's also a New America Fellow. And that journal really gets you inside bin Laden's head in the final months and weeks of his life. And of course, the big thing that was happening was the Arab Spring, and he was extremely concerned that he somehow could intervene to get people to think that he was one of the leaders of the Arab Spring. Of course, this was totally delusional, since no one was really asking his opinion about it. But one of the surprising things, perhaps for viewers and for readers of the book, is the extent to which he relied on his two oldest wives to do a lot of his writing and thinking. Two of them, they both had PhDs, one in child psychology, one in Quranic grammar. And bin Laden was assembling his two oldest wives and his two adult daughters and his adult son to have almost nightly meetings to discuss kind of what they would say about the Arab Spring, how they should position themselves. He was keenly aware the 10th anniversary of 9/11 was approaching. He wanted to make a big statement about that. He wanted to make a big statement both on the terrorist front, but also on the ideological front. In fact, he was considering issuing some kind of apology, strangely, on behalf of al-Qaeda. You, Brian, know this from all your work on al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had killed thousands, tens of thousands of civilians in Iraq, and bin Laden was very kind of cognizant of that fact. And he was thinking of issuing an apology, sort of saying, not an apology to the hated Americans, of course, but an apology to Muslims, to saying, look, al-Qaeda is going to be rebranded as a group that doesn't attack Muslim civilians. And so these kinds of, we know a lot more about bin Laden because of these documents, and they were only released in full, actually, during the Trump administration. So there's a big documentary kind of trove that I was also able to draw on. And I always wanted to write this book, to be honest. I mean, yes, very simple, because I'd written an oral history back in 2006, and I think it was sort of a missed opportunity to really write a fully fledged biography.
I think one of the most striking aspects of the book is the degree to which you explain, you delve into bin Laden as a human being, not just as the sort of mythical, whether hero or villain leader of al-Qaeda. And going back even before al-Qaeda, I mean, this is a man that comes from a large, wealthy family in Saudi Arabia. And it almost feels, to the layperson, like it was inevitable that bin Laden was going to become the man that he was. How did he become the world's most infamous man when his brothers and his sisters and his parents did not? I mean,
that's such a great question, because I mean, it's it's kind of a controlled sociological experiment where he has 54 siblings, half siblings, half sisters, half brothers. None of them chose this path, yet they grew up in not dissimilar circumstances. And I try not to do too much armchair psychologizing in the book for all sorts of reasons, including that I'm not a psychologist, and I just don't think it's that helpful. I try and lay out for the reader how this happened rather than why this happened. The why question is, it's hard to answer. Often we don't even know ourselves well enough to completely understand our own motivations. So, trying to get inside somebody's head, what I try to show, and I'm glad you used the word, was it inevitable, is to show that it was a long sequence of radicalization. It didn't happen overnight. It took place over decades. None of it was really inevitable. There were potential off-ramps where he could have decided something else. And the book is an attempt to document why the shy religious son of a multi-millionaire, billionaire, turned into a leader of a group dedicated to the mass killing of civilians. And this is what the book attempts to do. And that's really also why I decided to write it. And there's a library of books. I don't want to compare Hitler and bin Laden; they're very different. But I mean, there's a library of books about Hitler and his motivations. In fact, Ron Rosenbaum wrote a brilliant book about trying to answer the why question about Hitler. And at the end of the day, it's not completely explicable. And some of the, I think the last time that we had a conversation, I wrote a book called United States of Jihad, and you've kindly hosted me at the Commonwealth Club. And when I looked into these cases of Americans who adopted al-Qaeda or ISIS-like ideas, I often found that they weren't, they themselves weren't particularly articulate explicators of why they turned to this. I mean, there was a cocktail of reasons they might get involved in violent jihadism, but take Jahar Sarnieff, the younger Sarnieff brother who killed the 6-year-old boy at the Boston Marathon, and 2 others. I mean, if he was here or asked by you, like, why did you do it? He just would not have a very articulate explanation. He'd have some vague mumblings about American foreign policy, but lots of people are opposed to American foreign policy. Few of them, decide to launch 9/11 or kill, innocent spectators at a Boston Marathon. So there's a certain element where you can't, at the end, you kind of hit a brick wall to some degree, because there's no really rational why reason, but there is a process, and I document the process in bin Laden's case.
Let me try to get at this question, but without using the word why. Are there a couple of specific kind of forks in the road? I mean, I guess I'm asking for counterfactuals, but what are some of those choices where he went right, or events took him right, maybe, and he might have gone left?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first one is the death of his father, age 10. One of the striking things is bin Laden barely met his father. As far as I can tell, he only had one-on-one meeting with his father in his entire life. His parents divorced when he was 2. Bin Laden's dad had 20 other wives. He had 54 siblings. Bin Laden barely knew his dad, but his dad died in an air crash, in 1967 when bin Laden was 10. And by his own account, it had a big impact on him. And he told his family in the bin Laden family journal that he really began to study the Quran as a result of the death of his father. That's when he turned more religious. So he becomes a religious teenager. He becomes, almost surprised. I mean, even in 1970s, Saudi Arabia, bin Laden stood out. He'd get friends over his house to chant religious songs about Palestine when he was a teenager. It's not typical teenage behavior. He was praying an extra, in the middle of the night, an extra set of prayers. He was fasting twice a week. So this very religious teenager, that was sort of the basis. And then, according to Steve Cole, our former boss at New America, he encountered somebody from the Muslim Brotherhood at his high school in Saudi Arabia, somebody who may or may not have been in the Muslim Brotherhood, but certainly had those ideas. That influenced him to turn even sort of towards those ideas. And then, of course, you have 79, which is the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, the overthrow of a secular dictator in Iran by Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious zealot, the attack on Mecca by religious zealots. And so that was a very significant year. And, of course, then bin Laden himself traveled to Pakistan within 2 weeks of the Soviet invasion. And for the first 4 years of the anti-Soviet war in Afghanistan, he was going back and forth, raising money. He'd raised millions of dollars for the Afghan mujahideen. And then in '84, this is a transformational moment. He went into Afghanistan, regretted that he hadn't gone earlier. People had told him it was too dangerous. It was very dangerous. And one of the I think the myths that the book kind of helps demolish is, whatever else he was, bin Laden was fighting the Soviets in an almost suicidally brave manner. There's a wonderful book in Arabic that was written by a guy called Abdul Badaji, who he published a book in '91, and he interviewed a lot of people who are the Afghan Arabs like bin Laden. He had access to walkie-talkie transmissions, and it's a book that also takes the Afghan Arabs to task for their mistakes. So even though it's sympathetic, it's also, I think, a pretty reliable piece of history. And of course, Jamal Khashoggi also documented these guys when he was a journalist as a young journalist in Saudi Arabia in 1988. He visited bin Laden. And so I think another transformational moment was the Battle of Jaji in 1987, where bin Laden fought the Soviets. And out of the Battle of Jaji grew the base they had called at Jaji was called Al Qaeda. And Al Qaeda, the base, became kind of the name of the group by 1988. But a year after the Battle of Jaji, they began meetings to sort of formalizing the founding of Al Qaeda in a more formalized manner. And there was nothing there to indicate an anti-American. We have the minutes of those meetings, which maybe anybody who's taking notes at a meeting knows that the note taker can put his or her own spin on it. But the point is that we have kind of contemporaneous documents about the founding of Al Qaeda. There was nothing in there about the United States. Bin Laden was quite anti-American because of this U.S. support for Israel by his own account, and I believe this, and also by other eyewitnesses. In the mid to late 80s, he's delivering speeches in Riyadh and Jeddah, criticizing the United States, calling for a boycott of American goods because of its support for Israel. And then, the invasion of Kuwait, Saddam threatening Saudi Arabia, that, bin Laden famously offered his troops to the Saudi royal family. They laughed that idea out of court. I think that seemed to really piss him off. And he had a number of projects actually in this period, all of which did not go well. He wanted to intervene in southern Yemen, which at the time there was a kind of quasi-Marxist state that he wanted to overthrow. The Saudi government wasn't in favor of that, and they actually favored a unified Yemen, which what happened. He wanted to intervene in Afghanistan, where the Soviets had been defeated, but they hadn't. There was a communist government. The Afghans didn't treat him seriously. They saw him as a money guy, not as a military guy, which is exactly right. I mean, every military engagement that bin Laden got involved in, the Battle of Jaji was he was rescued by the Afghans essentially. The Battle of Jalalabad in 1989 was a fiasco in which a lot of his men were killed. 9/11 itself was a tactical success, but a strategic failure. So this guy was not a big military genius by any stretch. Had no military training. And yet he set up this military organization. I think obviously he had a big ego or something, but
Peter, can I ask you two questions there? Because I do think that there's, your book documents two key periods here that I think have sort of contributed to the public understanding of Al-Qaeda in ways that I think are contrary to fact. One is, and you go at this very hard in the book, is, clarifying that the Arab volunteers in Afghanistan in the 1980s were militarily insignificant and were not a major component of the fight. And yet that experience was, whatever bin Laden did there, it was key to his mythology going forward, both among potential supporters and his enemies. And then this point that you just made about 9/11 as a strategic failure and a strategic mistake by Al-Qaeda. Can you talk about those two pieces? Because I think that those are probably going to challenge some assumptions that folks listening have.
Yeah, well, certainly, the Afghan Arabs, bin Laden's team on the battlefields against the Soviet, they were, you said militarily insignificant. I think that's correct. I mean, there were at most 300 of them at any given moment. Estimates of the size of Afghans fighting the Soviets at any given moment, 175,000 to 250,000. So, and Afghans don't really need a lot of help with fighting, particularly from Saudis with no military experience. So, and there were some people in bin Laden's orbit who did have military experience. The Egyptians that he were the number two in Al Qaeda, Abu Hafs al-Masri. He was an Egyptian policeman and also had served in the Egyptian army, as a lot of Egyptian men had. So there were some people who did understand the battlefield, but whatever their understanding, they had no impact on the war. And so that, I think that's point number one. Point number two, I mean, the 9/11 attack, like Pearl Harbor for Imperial Japan, it was a tactical victory. It was not a strategic victory. And it kind of it backfired. I mean, bin Laden in 2004 released a videotape saying, "Hey, this was all a clever plan to suck the United States into the Middle East and bankrupt it." Well, there's no evidence that was his actual plan. At the time, he really believed his own propaganda, which is the United States is weak. I mean, when we interviewed him in '97 for CNN, he was comparing us to the Americans to the former Soviet Union. He really believed that if apply enough political pressure to the United States, we'll pull out of the Middle East. Instead, of course, we invaded Afghanistan, launched the Iraq War. We have bases today in Kuwait and Qatar and UAE that didn't exist before 9/11. So it backfired spectacularly. It didn't work, people. There are some people who sort of believe that he did want to suck us into endless wars, but that is really to accept bin Laden's own post facto judgment of his own failures.
Bin Laden goes on the run after 9/11. He was surrounded at Tora Bora. And, when we think about counterfactual, when I think about counterfactuals, it's not so much bin Laden's choices, but it's American choices. Explain what happened at Tora Bora for folks that are listening and the decision-making among Americans, because, we're in this, we're having, and I'll ask you about this more pointedly later on, but we're in the midst of this process of withdrawing from Afghanistan. And there was a moment in Tora Bora in, 20 years ago now, where the sort of core immediate goal after 9/11 of disrupting Al-Qaeda and finding bin Laden might have been achieved, and it was not. What happened there, and how did that process?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the word counterfactuals, and I don't do a lot of them in the book, but I do a counterfactual about, let's say we captured or killed bin Laden at Tora Bora. I think it would be much harder to make it would have been harder to continue the Afghan war. That after all, was all about bin Laden. It might have been easier to make a deal with the Taliban if Al Qaeda was kind of like essentially sidelined. It might have been harder to make the argument for the Iraq War, which was predicated not only on the weapons of mass destruction, but on the supposed alliance between Saddam and bin Laden that wasn't true. But if bin Laden had been captured or killed, things might have been different. It didn't happen, and now we have, you asked me like why write this book now. I mean, I'll tell you, one interesting document is Ayman al-Zawahiri's the leader of Al Qaeda. He released his own account in 2015 of the Battle of Tora Bora. And a very specific kind of account of what bin Laden did and the day he escaped and the time. And I'd always known that it was around this time, but now we have Ayman al-Zawahiri, who escaped the battlefield with bin Laden, saying on the night of December 12, 2001, at 11 p.m., bin Laden disappeared. The reason that is so interesting is we know that was exactly, there's a 8.5 hour time difference between the United States and Afghanistan. So, is almost exactly at this moment that Donald Rumsfeld is doing a lengthy discussion with General Tommy Franks, the commander of the Afghan war, about the Iraq war plans. Now, the Iraq war plans were 800 pages, and Rumsfeld had told Tommy Franks he had a week to rewrite them. And then he did the briefing. They did the briefing that day. So literally as the World Trade Center continued to smolder, and I went back to see when the pile stopped smoldering, and it was still smoldering on December 12th. The architect of 9/11 is essentially escaping the battlefield. We didn't put extra boots on the ground. There were more journalists than American soldiers at the Battle of Tora Bora, by my count. And the reason I say that with some certainty, Dalton Fury, which is the pseudonym of Tom Greer, unfortunately now dead, special forces officer who led the American forces at Tora Bora, he counted a total of 70 American special forces and total of 70 that included 12 people from the British Special Boat Service. So, and then I went to Nick Robertson of CNN and also Susan Glasser of the Washington Post, who both of them were at the battle, asked them their estimate of how many journalists there were there, and both of them said there were about 100. So the point is if the journalists could get there, it's not like they have, C-130s and Apache helicopters, that we just, and in fact, Jim Mattis in his new book, interesting, of course, then Brigadier General Jim Mattis, Marine commander, had up to 1,500 Marines in just outside Kandahar. And he put forward a plan to put Marines in observation posts around Tora Bora. The plan it sort of died on the vine. And there was also the 10th Mountain Division in Uzbekistan. 10th Mountain specializes in alpine warfare. Tora Bora is kind of a wintry, mountainous area at the time of the Battle of Tora Bora, and that they weren't deployed either. So the point is that we didn't try. And I'm not saying that if we had tried, it would have worked, because the mountains go up to 14,000 feet. It's 6 miles by 6 miles long. You've got the back, you can go into Pakistan very easily. You can, and bin Laden, eventually escaped. So, and it was the middle of Ramadan. The Afghans were fasting. It was, everything that, but the main thing is we just didn't try really in any serious way. And it was known to Bush administration officials that bin Laden was there. They said so publicly. Despite they kind of did a reinterpretation of what happened when the election came up in 2004, and they began to all say, well, we don't really know if he was there or not. If you go back on the public record, Wolfowitz said he was there, Cheney said he was there. Contemporaneously, they all believed that he was at Tora Bora, and of course he was.
I mean, it's sort of a crystallization of the refocusing on Iraq and away from the immediate perpetrators of 9/11. And yet, Al-Qaeda was disrupted tremendously over the not only in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 with the U.S. attack on Afghanistan, but over ensuing years. They've conducted a number of attacks in the West. Their affiliates have grown and at times split off in different directions, most famously ISIS. Bin Laden ultimately winds up in this safe house in Abbottabad in Pakistan, not far from Pakistani, quote unquote, Pakistan's West Point. To what extent, while he is holed up there in this safe house, you're the only Western journalist to have visited the place. To what extent is he actually running the show for Al-Qaeda during those years? And what strings did he actually have to pull?
Yeah, so I was the only outside observer to get inside the compound. Obviously, there were a lot of journalists who were, which helped me kind of reconstruct the night that he was killed and also the way that he was living. So, there's two ways of looking at answering your question, Brian. One is, if you're running a business in the 19th century without the phone or email, and you're relying on messages hand carried, it's a hard way to run a business because messages get lost. People ignore your message pretending they never got it, or they send a reply and it gets lost, and it all takes months. So he was trying to micromanage his organization, but he was using a method that was, it was hard to micromanage without face-to-face meetings or phone calls or email. And so he did the best he could. And he was certainly intervening. I mean, as you know, he blocked the elevation of Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni American cleric. He blocked at his elevation to become the leader of al-Qaeda in Yemen. He told al-Shabaab, not to identify itself with al-Qaeda would be bad for fundraising. He, one of the things he said to almost all the affiliates he was in contact with is, don't try to set up a local Islamic state. Don't try and attack the near enemy government. Do focus on the United States. That was a kind of constant theme. So he was deep in the weeds. He would write 40-page memos to his top deputy, and then the top deputy would sort of distribute those orders, to different parts of the organization. So, it's you can make the argument that he was micromanaging the organization and really still in charge, or you can make the argument that it was hard for him to manage because just the way he had to kind of communicate in a very constrained way. Jim Clapper has a good line in the book, which is. Bin Laden was constantly telling people to attack the United States and kill Barack Obama and kill David Petraeus and don't bother with Vice President Joe Biden because he's not prepared to be president. But he was constantly tasking them with things that were completely preposterous. And Jim Clapper said, reading these documents reminded him of Hitler and the dying days of World War II when he was moving these army divisions around Europe that didn't really exist. So. It's a complicated picture of a sort of delusional guy trying to micromanage things with, to the best of his ability with the tools he had.
I think though there's a lesson there for all of us that study terrorism. Is that oftentimes the only insight folks have are what these people say, and what they say may be deeply divorced from reality. Saying you're going to blow up the Eiffel Tower doesn't mean you can blow up the Eiffel Tower. And I think that it's a stark reminder for, in my mind, and one of the risks, frankly, of some of the analysis that we see now based on statements that these folks make and throw out online. The barrier to entry is just so low. You can say whatever you want, doesn't mean you can back it up.
That is so true. And Bin Laden, is certainly. I think he famously said, Al-Qaeda does, they wave a flag and they kind of freak the world out. And he understood that that he could say things that were not really true that would produce a reaction. But in the end, he died knowing that his main goal of attacking the United States again had not happened. It was not a heroic end. And, at the beginning, you talked a little bit about, what is his legacy? He's still an inspirational figure even to ISIS, which of course is in a sort of fight with Al-Qaeda. I think he lingers on as sort of but I think over time, the half-life of, people's attention to Bin Laden is quicker and quicker and quicker. And if you look at polling data in the Muslim world, it actually tracks rather neatly with support for suicide bombing, which has cratered in Iraq, in Pakistan, and because so many of the victims were Muslim civilians. And Bin Laden's public kind of approval has also cratered, along with his approval for suicide bombing, which was kind of his signature tactic. I think eventually, Mike, I'm pretty sure this line was written by Michael Gerson, President Bush's speechwriter, but there's a great line about that Al-Qaeda would be eventually consigned to the unmarked grave of discarded lies. And I think that's a wonderful line. And it was in, I think, the 2002 kind of speech to Congress by President George W. Bush. Mm-hmm. And, we're getting to the point where, maybe we're getting to that point. It's not like he's a subject of great discussion now. He sort of entered into history. I'm sure he'll be an inspirational figure in the same way that, Stalin is still inspirational in some circles, but it doesn't mean that his ideas are, going to have a huge impact on the continuing. He had one of the things that Bin Laden did was he made it very simple, which is it's all the United States' fault. If the United States withdraws its support from the authoritarian governments in the Middle East, that everything will change. And that theory of history turned out not to be true because he didn't achieve what he hoped.
What would Bin Laden say about our withdrawal from Afghanistan today?
He'd be delighted, of course. And the problem on 9/11, the 20th anniversary, is we're going to have this split screen. In the last day or so, I'm reading accounts of Taliban on Humvees moving into cities. Humvees being, of course, U.S. Military hardware, which they've captured for the Afghan government. And so the split screen on 9/11 is going to be the Taliban, on American military hardware taking over. I don't know what Afghan city, but they've already taken Kunduz, which is a not insignificant city in the north. And in fact, if you look at their successes, they've been in the north, which is not the Taliban stronghold. They're making the calculation that we already have the south and the east. We're going to push from the north so that we can actually take Kabul. Now, will they be able to do that? They've got the Afghan National Army, which is semi-competent but not great. The Afghan Special Forces, who are competent but relatively small. Uzbek militias and Tajik militias that are all arming and ready to fight. They may be pretty tough. I mean, they're going to be fighting for their home territory. Ahmad Shah Massoud's son is, kind of organizing the Tajiks. You've seen Ismail Khan in Herat coming back. I mean, Ismail Khan, my wife said I didn't know he was still alive. He was one of the, Mujahideen warlords. But, these guys are serious fighters and they've spent their entire lives fighting. But yeah, bin Laden, of course, he would say, hey, I got what I wanted. It took 20 years. That, of course, isn't, I'm speculating, but, he would be reveling in this moment.
I want to come back to this because this is obviously a critical question and it's contemporary. But I want to stay focused on Al Qaeda a little bit first, which is what is the future of Al Qaeda? I mean, once you lose bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri steps in. There are other leaders out there that have experience. People talk about Saif al-Adil as a potential leader. How do you see that organization being able to function? It's been 10 years. They're still out there. We still hear from them occasionally. They still conduct attacks. Do they have a future? Does Al Qaeda have legs without Osama bin Laden?
Well, Zawahiri turned out to be a terrible leader, and a black hole of charisma, and not an inspirational figure. And one of the themes in the book, Brian, which I think would appeal to somebody like yourself and people who follow this in some detail, is the extent to which, and I include myself in this, people overestimated how important Zawahiri was to this organization. It turns out that Zawahiri had no role in any planning of attacks against the United States, including 9/11. He had no role on the big idea, which was attacking the United States. He was really focused on Egypt, and bin Laden could care less about that. Somebody's actually done a survey of bin Laden's statements, and top statement is anger at the United States and anger at the Saudis. These are the two big preoccupations, and I think Egypt is like number 29 down the list, or maybe number 32. It doesn't even feature. Bin Laden almost never talked about it, and that was Zawahiri's preoccupation. And when Zawahiri came back, Zawahiri spent 6 months in prison in Dagestan, as you may recall, in '97. That was right in the middle of the embassy planning, the planning for the attacks on the embassies in Africa. And when he comes back, he's kind of a supplicant in bin Laden's world, not a big thinker. And bin Laden uses him sort of as window dressing for his World Islamic Front because, of course, Zawahiri is Egyptian. But Zawahiri did not play an important part in Al Qaeda before 9/11. After 9/11, of course, he becomes the deputy, and now he's the leader. But he's managed this group into the ground. And if I was a U.S. counterterrorism official, I'd just leave him in place, because you mentioned Saif al-Adil. He would be a much more serious contender, a former Egyptian Special Forces officer who's kept an incredibly low profile, who's been with Al Qaeda since the beginning. He would be, but even if, let's say, Saif al-Adil took over the organization, Al Qaeda is, it's a local jihadi group in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, obviously, it has affiliates in Yemen, it has affiliates in North Africa, it has affiliates in East Asia, and they kind of wax and wane over time. Sometimes, if we have you may recall when Al Qaeda in Yemen actually controlled big chunks of the country. They don't now. You may recall when Al-Shabaab in Somalia controlled a good chunk of Somalia. That's not true now. That can change. So I think these things go up and down. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking, you're in San Francisco and we're in the Bay Area and I'm in Washington, D.C. Could Al-Qaeda carry out an attack in the United States? The answer is, I think it's highly unlikely. I mean, there's only been one attack by a foreign terrorist organization since 9/11 in the United States, and that was the Pensacola attack by a Saudi military officer, killed 3 American sailors in 2019. We still, it's not clear if that attack was directed by Al-Qaeda in Yemen or simply they were kind of generally aware of it. But I mean, if we'd had this conversation 2 years after 9/11 and we said that Al-Qaeda and its affiliates despite attempts, were not able to carry out a lethal terrorist attack in the United States. You would have said that's absurdly optimistic, but that is what's happened. That isn't to say that if we just let Afghanistan disappear into a giant civil war and it turns into a vortex of ungoverned spaces and every jihadi group in the world kind of pours in. We've seen the movie before, and we saw that in Iraq. And the thing I find surprising is Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, and President Joe Biden presided over that decision to pull down troops in Iraq to zero in December of 2011, and 3 years later, the Obama administration is back in Iraq because of the rise of ISIS. And ISIS and the Taliban are different, but there's some interesting similarities in their playbooks right now. You may recall, I know you will recall that whole campaign that Al Qaeda in Iraq did to attack prisons and get the prisoners released. That became the core of ISIS. And you're seeing this with the Taliban. The peace negotiations with the Taliban that we sort of essentially, we got the Afghan government to kind of go along with it, even though we didn't include them, and we forced them really to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. Well, those have mostly joined the Taliban, and every city the Taliban goes into now or town, first thing they do is they go to the prison and they let loose all these prisoners. So there's some interesting similarities between the Taliban advances and the ISIS advances. They're, of course, different organizations, but they're using freed prisoners. They're also using the sense that their victory is, people are not fighting the Taliban, and they didn't fight ISIS. And the Afghans have told me, and I'm surprised by this, the Afghan National Army is weaker than the Iraqi National Army was at the time of the 2014 ISIS campaign. And if that's true, it's sad.
Mm-hmm. But Peter, I think, and this is coming up in some of the questions folks are asking is, what's the alternative? We spent 20 years in Afghanistan. We've pumped trillions of dollars into the, ANSF, trying to build out a government that can fund itself and defend itself and do these sorts of things. And yet we see that within a matter of weeks, months, it's crumbling. Isn't it good money after bad to continue to invest?
Well, presidents as different as President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden all came up with similar kind of answers. And President Obama wanted to go to zero. Then he did a kind of cost-risk benefit analysis. He left 8,400 troops. Trump wanted to go to zero, never got there, but he certainly was drawing down. And President Joe Biden is going to zero at the end of the month. So certainly, very different presidents and kind of arrived at sort of similar conclusions. But my answer would be the following. We're still in South Korea 75 years after the armistice that ended the hostilities. We have 25,000 troops in South Korea. It was one of the poorest countries in the world in 1953, and now it's one of the richest. And South Korea and Afghanistan are not, it's not like they're exactly the same, but there are some similarities in the sense that 20 years is actually not that long a time in the grand scheme of things. If I went back and I looked at the history of South Korea was has been an authoritarian democracy for a long time, or a military junta. It's not like they were a democratic state as they are now for much of their history. And of course, Afghanistan is an imperfect democracy in the sense that the government, I think our big mistake, two big mistakes, was one, treating the Taliban as a government in waiting. We, the United States, did that, as opposed to the actual government that we had supported. Mm-hmm. And then excluding that government from any discussions with the Taliban. At the end of the day, if there's going to be peace, it's got to be between the Afghan government and the Taliban, not between us. These peace negotiations were really withdrawal negotiations for the United States. And I just think it could be managed very differently. So if we had left one Marine, we're going to obviously leave some Marines outside the U.S. Embassy so it doesn't get overrun. Mm-hmm. But part of our problem has been a messaging problem in the sense that, December 1st, 2009, President Obama goes to West Point. He delivers his surge speech, but he also talks about withdrawal. And so we've been talking about withdrawal for a long time, which has had an effect on the Taliban, the Afghan government, the Afghan people, Pakistan, and people have taken us seriously that we're leaving shortly. And I think that it could have been, I think a part of it actually, this is a sort of maybe bigger observation, but the United States is an anti-empire project from the beginning, and we're very uncomfortable with aspects of empire, even though we are the world superpower. And the fact is that I do believe that we have some interests in Afghanistan that are worth preserving. whether that's preventing another Al Qaeda rise or preserving the girls and women the kind of the rights that they've received in the sort of post-Taliban era. And I say all that because I spent time in Afghanistan under the Taliban, and the population of Kabul then was 500,000. It's now, no one knows what the number is, 4 million, 5 million. There was no phone service, there was no internet service, there was no economy. The World Bank stopped measuring economic indicators in Afghanistan because there were none in the Taliban era. It was, let's say even if the Taliban do become the government again, there's no evidence that they're going to be different, and they have no plan for real governance. They want to make the world pure and have their version of Sharia law, and they think that's sufficient. And I think the good thing is Afghanistan is one of the youngest countries in the world. I think 70% of the population is under the age of 25, and I don't think for most of those men and women, there's no great nostalgia for the Taliban. They know what happened, but we'll see. I mean, I think what will happen for sure is a very nasty civil war. And, the weakness of the Afghan National Army is one thing. The Afghan Special Forces do have some capacity, but I would also look at the Tajik militias, the Uzbek militias, the Hazara militias. These guys, fought a brutal civil war again, and they've fought the Taliban. They're ready to do it again. So instead of the Taliban taking over the entire country, I think what we have condemned Afghanistan to is a kind of nasty civil war that makes the present conflict look like a croquet match. And we may have to intervene again. We did it in Iraq because events in Afghanistan have a way of kind of not staying there. For a country that's relatively insignificant, it's actually played an outside role in American kind of foreign policy, whether the defeat of the Soviet Union there or the 9/11 attacks.
What do the when you were going through the documents from that were collected in Abbottabad, and I want to pivot and ask you about the raid itself and the development of that raid and how the U.S. government understood the rise of Bin Laden and then ultimately the hunt for him. But skipping ahead a little bit, what was the relationship between Al Qaeda and the Taliban now, and does that tell us anything about how we can understand? I mean, the Taliban, on the one hand, they did come negotiate with us. Al Qaeda wouldn't have done that. They have had long-term relationships with the Pakistani government and dealt with others in responsible or at least they have had discourse in ways that Al Qaeda would not. What should we understand as the sort of relationship, and what's the same about Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and what's the difference? Like, tease the we are your Arizona State students. What's the difference?
Well, I mean, there's differences, but I want to respond to one of the things that you just said, which is about the Taliban peace negotiations. Because I think the Taliban had no intention of making peace. They just they won more on the battle. They won more at the negotiating table in Doha than they ever won at the battlefield because they got us to pull out. And I think it was a very clever ruse, and it was one we were prepared to go along with, perhaps. But it was, they have no intention. They were supposed to divorce themselves from Al Qaeda, according to the United Nations in June. Their relations remain very close. I mean, the United Nations is not an organization, as I see, promoting war. And here is the official report saying that Al Qaeda and Taliban are very close. And in fact, they even said those relations are getting tighter because of intermarriage. And of course, the Taliban is a Pashtun ethnic group that wants to install a theocratic state across all of Afghanistan. That is not Al Qaeda's kind of goal. Al Qaeda has a much bigger vision of getting the United States to pull out of the Middle East and hoping that Taliban-style theocracies will stretch from Indonesia to Morocco. I think I'm just trying to summarize the differences of what they want. So one is a nationalist movement, with a kind of totally nutcase religious fundamentalist aspect to it. I mean, Mullah Omar called himself the commander of the faithful. Well, the commander of the faithful means that he's the commander of all Muslims everywhere. I mean, it's not a modest statement. He was a religious fanatic with delusions of grandeur, and he was close to Bin Laden. So the differences I think, are less important than the similarities, in the sense that these guys, the documents you asked about, the documents show joint operations between the Al Qaeda and the Taliban and the Haqqani network. The documents show Al Qaeda funding the Taliban, which is kind of interesting because you think of the Taliban as being more well funded than Al Qaeda. The documents show bin Laden's writing letters to Mullah Omar in the weeks before he was killed, letters from Tayyab Agha to Al Qaeda, Tayyab Agha was the main negotiator for the Taliban with the Americans. So the documents portray a pretty warm relationship, but of course those are 10 years old now. But fast forward to the UN report and fast forward to accounts of Al Qaeda being on the front lines today. I was always skeptical that these groups would somehow. I think people make a mistake when they think everybody's going to behave like a rational actor, because the rational actor, there was a bunch of, I would say, Taliban apologists, and you know who they are, Brian. I mean, they always said, well, the Taliban will, they'll just kind of, they'll realize what a disaster of 9/11 was for them, and they'll just do the right thing and separate themselves from Al Qaeda. Well, the documentary record suggests that's not true. I do think, however, that there was a moment that was missed in 2002. The Taliban were really defeated, and I think that it would have been easier to have a peace negotiation with them then, when they were defeated and ready to talk. And that was, basically that was a road not taken. But today, then the idea they're going to do a peace negotiation with the Afghan government is ludicrous on its face. But that was one of the premises of our, peace negotiations that began in earnest in 2018.
Yeah. I want to. I have a lot of questions for you, Peter. I could pick your brain on Afghanistan all day. I'm going to go to the audience, though. I've been summarizing a few of those questions, but there are a couple here that are interesting. One is, do you have any idea why bin Laden never attacked Israel over Palestine?
That is such a great question. And, Hamid Mir, who's one of the people that I quote in the book, asked bin Laden that question directly. And, Hamid Mir says that bin Laden he just didn't have a good answer to that. And it's like he hadn't even considered the question. So I'm trying to do my best to answer for bin Laden through this question from Hamid Mir. For some reason, even though Israel was he started thinking about Palestine when he was a teenager, and being focused on the issue, he may have calculated that, Al Qaeda, it wasn't, I don't know what the fact is he didn't. And why he didn't is sort of a mystery. I can add another point, which is he really thought of New York as sort of a Jewish target, I think. I mean, if you think about, Mullah Omar was asked after 9/11, kind of like about the Al Qaeda's role in the attacks, and he spouted an absurd conspiracy theory about the 4,000 Jews who didn't show up to work. So, I mean, both bin Laden, by the way, one of the anecdotes in the book, he named his daughter, who was born a few days after 9/11, Sophia. Why did he name her Sophia? Because Sophia was the aunt of the Prophet Muhammad who killed a Jew. And he told people, Hamid Mir, that he hoped that his daughter would grow up to kill Jews. So it's only, he was a profound anti-Semite and very anti-Israel, but he didn't attack Israel itself. And I mean, it's a question he couldn't really answer when he was asked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of questions here that I think point to some of our politics in the United States right now and the terrorist threat domestically. How do we understand, the continued threat from Al Qaeda, international terrorist groups like that, with the rise of more domestic terrorism? And I know the audience may not know, but you early in your career did a lot of work on domestic terrorism. How do you compare those differences, and do we ever get a bin Laden, coming from an American bin Laden?
Oh, interesting question. I mean, we at New America track all forms of political violence, and jihadist terrorists since 9/11 have killed, I think, like 107 people, I believe, and right-wing extremists have killed, 111. My numbers may be not precise, but I'm very close. And the point is that right-wing terrorism, of course, has been a very steady kind of threat in the United States, and long preceded 9/11 with the Oklahoma City bombing and other acts of right-wing violence. and of course, there's been other forms of political violence in the United States. Some people forget the 1970s, there were 100 hijackings in the United States, many of them for criminal purposes, but for a lot for political purposes. There were Puerto Rican nationalists who detonated 85 bombs in the 70s. There was the Weather Underground. There was the Black Panthers. So political violence is not, of various kinds, is a fairly constant feature of American life. So would there be an American bin Laden? No, because you can't have training camps in Oregon training thousands of people and have a secret organization where people pledge allegiance to bin Laden, and it would be very, very hard to do. But we do have obviously right-wing extremists, and we also have, interestingly, one of the things that we're tracking is the rise of ideological misogyny as a kind of and we track only lethal attacks, and we use a very conservative kind of methodology. So if there's some kind of question around ideology, we don't include it. But you're seeing an uptick of that, or not an uptick, but sort of you're also seeing some black nationalist lethal terrorist attacks, and you're seeing some rather small numbers of far leftist lethal attacks. But I mean, the big problem is the right-wing extremist attacks and also jihadi terrorism attacks. And the jihadi terrorist attacks tend to be, obviously Omar Mateen killed 49 people in Orlando in 2016 on the behalf of ISIS. So they're often more lethal. But anyway, the FBI, I think there's a narrative the FBI only kind of woke up to this recently. I actually don't really buy that. I think the FBI and anybody in law enforcement has been very concerned about right-wing extremism, because the people that these right-wing extremists often try and kill, as we saw at the January 6th insurrection, are police officers. And that goes back a really long way, because in the right-wing, sort of the totally crazy world of the Zionist occupation government and all that, they're enemies of the state, and they're legitimate targets. So I think law enforcement's actually been concerned about this for a long time, because it's a real issue.
Peter, I think there are some who argue, and I know I haven't read the book; it's about to come out, but Spencer Ackerman's got a book coming out called Reign of Terror, where he basically, I think, is connecting the process of fighting the war on terror and its impact on our domestic civil discourse, and is sort of undermining our own political norms. Do you see what is the impact of our sort of dedication and focus over the last 20 years in perpetual war fighting? Does that have an impact on who we are and how we talk to each other?
I think it does. Look, I've read the manuscript. Spencer Ackerman's a really smart guy. I don't agree with everything that he says, but I do say in my book that it's hard to explain the rise of Trump absent the war on terror, because if you go back to 2015, 2016, Americans were polled on the issue of terrorism, and they were asked the question, are you worried that you will be a victim of terrorism or a family member? And it was the highest number since just after 9/11, during that 2015, 2016 time, because of ISIS, the attack in Orlando. I mentioned the attack in the office party in California by the married couple. ISIS killed 130 people in Paris. There was a lot of coverage of, ISIS had beheaded American journalists and aid workers like Jim Foley and others. And there was a huge amount of news coverage of this. And Trump, came up with the idea of the travel ban, which, made no sense from a sort of factual point of view, but was actually quite popular. Half of Americans thought it was a good idea. And I'm not talking about half of Republicans, based on polling data. And if you ask Republicans, the number was like 80%. And, it was, so the point is that Trump was able to use that. And he didn't really talk about it as the threat receded. I think he could have made more of an issue about, he was involved, in the end of ISIS, and is one of his, I think, few foreign policy kind of pluses. But he really, it's hard to put yourself back in the pre-2016 presidential campaign, but terrorism was a big issue, and Trump tended to do better on the issue than Hillary Clinton because he had what appeared to be a really simple answer, which actually would have had no impact. I mean, the travel ban stopped under Joe Biden. It's not like we're suddenly having tons of terrorist attacks. And the people that the Saudi military officer that I described who killed 3 American sailors at Pensacola, well, the Saudis, which did a Saudi military officer carry out an attack, and he, of course, was not subject to the travel ban. So the point is, this was a solution in search of a problem that didn't really exist, but it was politically quite useful for Trump. So I do think there, everything has second and third order consequences, and I think Trump claimed that he saw a bunch of Arabs cheering on 9/11. Of course, that was untrue, but it played well with the base. So he was able to kind of tap into this kind of fear of terrorism that was very real in 2015, 2016. And I think it was a political advantage for him.
I want to come back. We only have a few minutes left, but I want to come back to this notion of the sort of whole picture of Osama bin Laden as both a terrorist mastermind, but also a family man. In Abbottabad, he was there living with several of his wives, kids, some bodyguards. Tell us about his life there and explain when American intelligence analysts and special forces operators are trying to figure out how to attack this compound, what sort of considerations did they have to go through as they're thinking about an assault on a compound with 25 people on it, including a bunch of children?
Yeah, the SEALs went in with a little laminated card with everybody they expected to see there, and they didn't know how many people there were. You said 25. There were 27. They couldn't have known that bin Laden had 2 other kids who were like under the age of 3 with his much younger wife, or they didn't probably know that some of his grandkids were living there. So. But the point is that they looked at one of the tells, and this was interestingly picked up by the New York Post when they just sort of took an extract from the book. A tell was that there was too much laundry on the lines for just the bodyguard and their families. There were 11 members of the bodyguards' families, and there were 16 of bin Laden's. And when they saw the amount of laundry that was being processed, they were like, "Oh, there's a third family here that seems to have a lot of kids and adults," and that sort of fit with bin Laden. You said the word family man. The New York Times ran the headline was of the review, "Fanatical Terrorist and Family Man." There was a lot of sort of like attacks from the right that kind of portraying as such was bad, and I think they changed the headline to something more bland, like "For the Picture of bin Laden." But the point is, it's like Hitler was nice to his dog. It doesn't mean that he was a nice guy. Hitler was somewhat nice to his girlfriend Eva Braun, who that doesn't mean that he was a great guy either. And so the idea that somehow the mass murderer bin Laden couldn't also be nice to his family and actually hold his wives in somewhat high regard because of their educational attainments, and they actually advised him. I mean, the fact that the idea that these can't be compatible is crazy, because we know from anyone who studies history knows that wars or acts of mass murder are carried out by humans with human kind of emotions and human stories. And, you can't, I'm not attempting to do a sort of tout comprendre, say tout pardonner, which is, if you understand everything, you forgive everything. That's not my intent here with this book. But bin Laden has entered history. And I think, as somebody, one of the few people in recent decades who's actually changed the course of history, I think we're all owed an explanation of who he was, and that doesn't pretend that he didn't have, his 3 wives and his dozen kids and grandkids for 5 years when he was living in that compound in Abbottabad. That's part of the story.
Yeah. Well, undoubtedly, the intelligence analysts putting together that targeting package had that as central to the story that they were looking for.
They did. The fact that this guy, the people who knew him the best, when I say knew him in the intelligence community, the fact that most fugitives don't take a dozen kids and grandkids along for the ride and 3 wives. But for the people who were really following bin Laden, they were like, wow, that's a tell that this is bin Laden, because this is exactly the way he lived in Sudan, with the multiple wives, with their own apartments, the multiple kids, exactly the same way he lived in Afghanistan. And here he is replicating it in Abbottabad. So for them, this was evidence that it really was bin Laden, because, of course, the case was entirely circumstantial. They didn't, they saw the large family as evidence for bin Laden being there, not as evidence of him not being there.
After bin Laden was killed, his body was dumped into the Arabian Sea. There was sort of a moment of almost disbelief in Washington, and decision making by President Obama about when and how to announce that he had been killed. Talk through that process, because I think in decision making, because I think it's important it was one of our only chances as the United States to shape that final legacy, to shape the understanding of how he went out. What was that process like?
Well, one thing that we learned from the documents in Abbottabad is that President Obama really got the timing right, because bin Laden had agreed with his bodyguards. One of the, he was paying them $100 a month. They were both rebelling, saying, "Hey, this is a very dangerous job. You're paying us very little. We want to leave. We are leaving." And so, in fact, relations got so bad that bin Laden wrote them a letter on January 15th, 2011, saying, "I know that we had a really bad argument. Let's get down in writing what our agreement is." And they agreed that the bodyguards would leave as early as July 2011. And so one of the reasons Obama made the decision he did is like, well, what if bin Laden leaves? And it turns out that he was going to be forced to leave, because the house wasn't in his name; it was in the bodyguard's name. The bodyguards were leaving. They were fed up, so the process of Obama getting to that decision, I can't get into it because it takes too long, because it was a very complicated process over a year. But it is one of the classic. You look at Kennedy's process during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Obviously, the stakes were higher; it was nuclear war. But we elect presidents to make decisions with imperfect information, not perfect information. And whether it was a Cuban Missile Crisis for Kennedy or it was the bin Laden raid for Obama, they both made decisions without knowing all the facts for sure. Not least in Obama's case, whether or not that was actually Osama bin Laden there. And one of the scenes in the book is there's a big discussion right with people that in the White House Situation Room, Mike Leiter, Nick Rasmussen, others, and there's a discussion of like, well, he's 40% there, he's 60% there, and Obama eventually just cuts it off and says, look, it's a 50-50, and when Obama made the decision, it's bin Laden is either 0% there or 100% there. So all this discussions of percentages gave this kind of false sense of mathematical rigor. Just smart people trying to put odds on something. And so he made a decision without having and that's what presidents are supposed to do, which is you're not making difficult decisions with perfect information. You're making difficult decisions with imperfect information. And that was one of these cases. And so I think it's a sort of textbook case of how a real process works. And obviously the president made the right decision. Of course, Joe Biden was against it.
Peter, we have less than 2 minutes left. But let me you end the book talking about the Baader-Meinhof gang and what happens when terrorists fade into history. Is that going to happen with Osama bin Laden?
I think it will. There's a scene where I say Gina Bennett, who was the first on the case, is still at the agency attached to the National Counterterrorism Center. She was a young colleague said to her the day that bin Laden died, great victory. And she said, well, the worst day is still ahead for them. And the young colleague said, what is that? She said, have you heard of the Baader-Meinhof gang? And the young colleague said, no, which of course was an infamous terrorist group in the 1970s in Germany. And Gina Bennett says, well, the worst day is when people in the counterterrorism center just don't know who these people are anymore. And obviously that, that's not, but she was saying it for effect, I think, but I think, he will just kind of recede. And, his influence on history, he didn't get what he wanted. So I think he will fade over time. He will not disappear. But he's certainly not the figure that he was, in the days and weeks after 9/11.
Our thanks to Peter Bergen, CNN national security analyst, vice president for global studies and fellow at New America, and author of the new book, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. We want to remind everyone that Peter's book is available online and at your local bookstore. We also want to thank all of our viewers. I'm Brian Fishman. And now this virtual program of the Commonwealth Club of California is adjourned. Thank you.